The dust-choked horizon shimmered beneath the merciless Arizona sun as Beatrice Sawyer clutched her torn map and squinted at the endless sea of sagebrush before her. Her once pristine traveling dress was now stained with the red dirt of a territory that seemed determined to swallow her whole, just as it had devoured her hopes of a new beginning after fleeing Boston's suffocating society. The year was 1876. The nation had just celebrated its centennial while Beatrice had buried her father, sold their failing textile business, and boarded a westbound train with nothing but a carpet bag of belongings and an advertisement for a teaching position in Silver Creek. The stage coach that was supposed to deliver her had broken an axle 10 miles back, the driver continuing on horseback to fetch help while assuring her to stay put, miss. That was yesterday. Now, parched and disoriented after attempting to walk toward what she thought was civilization, Beatrice stumbled over a rock and fell to her knees. Her water canteen empty since dawn clattered against stone. The rough terrain had torn her boots, and blood stained her stockings where thorns had pierced through to skin. "Lord help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The distant howl of a coyote sent shivers down her spine despite the scorching heat. Was this to be her end? 22 years of life concluded in this desolate wilderness. The sound came so suddenly that at first she thought it was her imagination, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching from behind. Turning, Beatrice shielded her eyes from the sun and saw the silhouette of a rider emerging from the heat waves that distorted the landscape. As the figure drew closer, she could make out a tall man atop a chestnut stallion. His broad shoulders were draped in a dust-coated duster, and a worn Stetson hat cast shadows across his face. A rifle was holstered alongside his saddle, and the silver star pinned to his vest caught the sunlight. The rider pulled his horse to a stop several paces from her. For a long moment, he simply observed her taking in her torn dress, her disheveled hair that had long escaped its pins, and the desperate hope that must have been evident in her eyes. "Madam," he said finally, his voice deep and measured with the unhurried cadence of the West. "You look a fair ways from anywhere you ought to be." Beatrice swallowed her pride along with what little moisture remained in her mouth. "I lost my way," she admitted, fighting back tears that would waste precious water her body couldn't spare. The cowboy's expression softened beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached, removing a canteen from his saddle. "Then you've found me," he said, offering the water, "and that's enough for now." As their fingers brushed during the exchange, Beatrice felt a current that had nothing to do with the relentless heat. She took a careful sip, then another, studying him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with a strong jawline weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a startling shade of blue against his tanned skin, watched her with an intensity that made her both uneasy and inexplicably safe. "Xavier Morgan," he introduced himself, taking back the canteen once she'd drunk her fill. "Sheriff of Silver Creek." "Beatrice Sawyer," she replied, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. "I was headed to Silver Creek myself." "There's a teaching position at the schoolhouse," he finished for her. "Town's been waiting on you for 3 weeks. When you didn't arrive on yesterday's stage, folks got worried." He paused, glancing at the vast emptiness surrounding them. "Driver said you'd decided to wait with the coach. Wasn't too pleased to find you gone when I rode out there." Beatrice flushed with embarrassment. I believed I could see a town in the distance. It seemed so close." Xavier shook his head, but there was no ridicule in his expression. "That's the desert playing tricks, Miss Sawyer. Those mountains haven't gotten any closer no matter how long you've been walking toward them." He gestured toward his horse. "Silver Creek's about 8 miles northwest. You've been headed southeast straight into Apache territory." The revelation sent a chill through Beatrice despite the heat. I had no idea." "Most Easterners don't," Xavier said simply. He extended a hand. "Think you can ride? We should get moving before sundown." Beatrice hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. His hand was calloused but gentle as he assisted her onto the horse. then mounted behind her with practiced ease. The proximity was improper by every social standard she'd been raised with, but as they began the journey toward Silver Creek, with the solid warmth of his chest against her back and his arms reaching around her to hold the reins, Beatrice found herself grateful for the impropriety. "Have you been sheriff long, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, desperate to distract herself from both her fear and the unsettling awareness of him. 3 years, he answered, his breath stirring the loose strands of her hair. "Took over after the last one caught a bullet meant for someone else." The casual mention of violence reminded Beatrice just how far she'd traveled from the genteel parlors of Boston. Is Silver Creek dangerous then? She felt rather than saw his shrug. Town itself is peaceful enough these days. Got the usual troublemakers, minors with too much drink, cowboys passing through looking for entertainment. Nothing the cells at the jailhouse can't handle. There was a pause before he added, "It's the territory around that needs watching." Renegade Apache bands to the south, cattle rustlers working the northern ranges, and occasionally someone running from the law elsewhere decides our little corner of Arizona might make a good hiding spot. Beatrice absorbed this information with growing apprehension. Had she been naive to think she could simply transplant herself into this wild land? The teaching position had seemed like providence when she'd read the advertisement, good pay, housing provided, and far enough from Boston that nobody would know the scandal that had driven her west. As if sensing her thoughts, Xavier spoke again. "Town's got about 400 souls now. Good folks, mostly. They've been saving up for a proper teacher going on 2 years. The children been learning their letters from Widow Jenkins, but she's getting on in years and never had much schooling herself." "How many students will there be?" Beatrice asked, grateful for the practical topic. 28 at last count," Xavier replied, "ages 5 to 16. Miners' children, ranchers' kids, shopkeepers' little ones. Even a few from the Apache reservation when they're not needed for seasonal work." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Native children will attend the school," Xavier's voice held a note of caution. "That going to be a problem, Miss Sawyer?" "No," she answered quickly. In Boston, I never encountered." She trailed off, realizing there was no way to complete the sentence without sounding ignorant. "You'll find the West doesn't always abide by Eastern notions," Xavier said, his tone neither approving nor condemning. "Silver Creek has its share of prejudices, same as anywhere, but Judge Holloway, who oversees the territory, believes education might be the bridge between worlds. Some agree with him, some don't. As teacher, you'll be walking that line." Beatrice considered this. She'd come west seeking a fresh start, hadn't she? Perhaps this was part of that learning to see the world through new eyes. "I look forward to teaching all of my students," she said with quiet determination. Xavier made a non-committal sound, but she thought she felt him relax slightly behind her. They rode in silence for a time, the rhythmic movement of the horse lulling Beatrice into a strange comfort despite her circumstances. The landscape gradually changed, sagebrush giving way to scattered pine trees as they climbed in elevation. The air grew marginally cooler, and in the distance she could make out what appeared to be buildings nestled in a valley. "Is that Silver Creek?" she asked, hope rising in her voice. "That's it," Xavier confirmed. "Not much to look at compared to Boston, I expect." Beatrice studied the approaching town, a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, a white church steeple rising above the rest, scattered homes spreading outward from the center. It was indeed nothing like Boston's grand architecture and bustling avenues, but something about the sight filled her with unexpected emotion. "It's perfect," she whispered, then felt foolish for the sentiment. Xavier said nothing, but she could feel his gaze on her profile as they continued their approach. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they finally rode into Silver Creek. Despite her exhaustion, Beatrice sat straighter as curious faces turned to observe their arrival. Women in simple dresses paused in their errands to watch. Men removed hats in polite acknowledgement. Children darted alongside the horse for a few paces before being called back by parents. Xavier guided his horse directly to a two-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Silver Creek Hotel and Dining Room. As he dismounted and reached up to help her down, Beatrice became acutely aware of her disheveled state. Her torn dress, wind-tangled hair, and dirt-streaked face must present a shocking contrast to the neatly attired townspeople. Sheriff Morgan. A plump woman with gray-streaked hair hurried from the hotel entrance. "You found her, thank the Lord, Mrs. Patterson," Xavier nodded in greeting. "This is Miss Beatrice Sawyer, our new schoolteacher. She had a bit of trouble with the stagecoach, Mrs." Patterson clucked sympathetically, taking in Beatrice's appearance. "You poor dear. Come inside right away. We've kept your room ready these 3 weeks, and I'll have a bath drawn immediately." Overwhelmed by the woman's efficiency and kindness, Beatrice found herself being ushered toward the hotel entrance. She paused only to look back at Xavier, who remained beside his horse, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Thank you, Sheriff Morgan," she said, suddenly feeling the inadequacy of the words. "You saved my life today." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "Just doing my job, Miss Sawyer." He touched the brim of his hat in a small salute. "Welcome to Silver Creek, as Mrs." Patterson led her inside, chattering about the town and the excitement over the new teacher's arrival. Beatrice couldn't help glancing back once more. Xavier Morgan was already mounting his horse, preparing to ride away. Something about his solitary figure against the backdrop of the setting sun struck her with unexpected force, as if she were witnessing something significant that she couldn't yet comprehend. Little did she know how thoroughly that man would append her carefully constructed new beginning in Silver Creek. 2 hours later, Beatrice sat at a small table in the hotel dining room, feeling almost human again after a bath and change of clothes. Mrs. Patterson had lent her a simple blue dress while her own garments were being laundered and repaired. The dining room was modestly appointed but clean, with a dozen tables and a small bar along one wall. Several townspeople were scattered at various tables, each having found some reason to visit the hotel dining room this evening that coincidentally allowed them to glimpse their new schoolteacher. Beatrice pretended not to notice their curious glances as she ate the hearty stew. Mrs. Patterson had insisted she needed to put some meat back on those bones. The food was simple but delicious after her ordeal, and she was just finishing when the dining room door swung open and Xavier Morgan entered. He changed as well, his dusty trail clothes replaced by a clean white shirt and dark vest, though the sheriff's star remained pinned in place. His dark hair, damp from what must have been his own bath, curled slightly at his collar. Without the shadow of his hat, his features were even more striking: the strong line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at least once, and those penetrating blue eyes that immediately found her across the room. Several diners called greetings to him, which he acknowledged with brief nods without breaking his stride toward her table. "Mind if I join you, Miss Sawyer?" he asked, his deep voice carrying just enough to be heard at her table and not beyond a courtesy she appreciated given the obvious interest of the other patrons. "Please do," she replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. He settled into it with a grace that belied his size. Mrs. Patterson appeared almost instantly with a mug of coffee and another bowl of stew, clearly having anticipated his arrival. "How are you feeling?" he asked once Mrs. Patterson had bustled away. "Much improved, thank you." Beatrice felt oddly shy under his direct gaze. "Mrs. Patterson has been very kind. She mothers everyone in town," Xavier said with a hint of fondness. "Been running this hotel since her husband passed in '68, does most of the cooking herself." An awkward silence fell as Xavier began eating and Beatrice struggled to find an appropriate topic of conversation. The events of the day, her near-death experience and rescue, seemed too intimate to revisit in this public setting. "I understand I'll be seeing the schoolhouse tomorrow," she finally offered. Xavier nodded. "Mayor Clarkson and Judge Holloway want to formally welcome you. They've arranged for you to meet some of the town council at 10 o'clock. "I see," Beatrice hesitated. "And the accommodations?" The advertisement mentioned housing provided with the position. "There's a small house behind the schoolhouse," Xavier explained. "Nothing fancy, 2 rooms and a kitchen. It was built last year specifically for the teacher." The idea of having her own home, even a modest one, filled Beatrice with unexpected excitement. In Boston, she'd lived her entire life in her father's house, always under his authority and watchful eye. Even as an adult, she'd never experienced true independence. "That sounds perfect," she said sincerely. Xavier studied her face. "Most ladies from the East expect more comfort than Silver Creek can provide." "I'm not most ladies," Beatrice replied, then immediately worried she'd sounded defensive. But Xavier's expression softened into something that might have been approval. "No, I don't believe you are." The way he said it, as though he'd recognized something in her that others had missed, sent an unexpected warmth through Beatrice's chest. Sheriff Morgan. A young boy no more than 12 burst through the door, his freckled face flushed with excitement or exertion. "Sheriff, Pa says to come quick. There's trouble at the Rusty Nail." Xavier was on his feet in an instant, all traces of relaxation vanishing from his demeanor. "Excuse me, Miss Sawyer." "Duty calls?" "Of course," she murmured, watching as he strode toward the door, pausing only to place coins on the bar for his meal. "What kind of trouble, Tommy?" he asked the boy, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet dining room. "Cattle drovers just in from the North Range," the boy reported importantly. "Got into it with some miners over a card game. Pa says there's guns involved." A collective tension seemed to spread through the room. Beatrice saw several diners exchange knowing glances. "Stay here," Xavier told the boy firmly before disappearing through the door. As soon as he was gone, the dining room erupted in hushed conversations. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Beatrice's elbow, clucking her tongue disapprovingly. "Always the same when the cattle drives finish," she said, collecting Beatrice's empty bowl. "Men with money burning holes in their pockets and too much time away from civilization. Sheriff will sort them out. Is it dangerous?" Beatrice couldn't help asking, thinking of Xavier walking into what sounded like an armed confrontation. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. "Sheriff Morgan knows how to handle himself, dear. He's kept peace in this town through worse than a saloon dispute." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Though I will say a prayer tonight, same as I do whenever he walks into trouble." The woman's concern only heightened Beatrice's own anxiety. She'd known Xavier Morgan for mere hours, yet the thought of him facing armed men made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should retire," Beatrice said, suddenly feeling the day's exhaustion pressing down on her. "Of course, dear, you've had quite an ordeal, Mrs." Patterson helped her to her feet. "Your room is the 3rd door on the right at the top of the stairs. I've left a nightgown and some basic toiletries for you there." Beatrice thanked her and made her way upstairs, acutely aware of the curious gazes following her progress. Her room was small but comfortable, a narrow bed with a quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small writing desk beneath the window, and a wardrobe for clothing. The window overlooked the main street, and Beatrice found herself drawn to it. In the gathering darkness, she could see lanterns illuminating the wooden boardwalks that lined both sides of the street. Directly across and down, a short distance, stood a building with swinging doors and windows bright with lamplight, the Rusty Nail Saloon, she presumed. Even from here, she could hear the muffled sounds of raised voices. For a long moment, she stood watching, half expecting to hear gunshots. Instead, after several tense minutes, she saw a group of men emerge from the saloon. Though the distance made it difficult to be certain, she thought she recognized Xavier's tall figure in the center, appearing to escort 2 other men down the street toward what must be the jailhouse. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by confusion at the intensity of the feeling. Xavier Morgan was virtually a stranger to her. Why should his safety matter so personally? Shaking off the unsettling thought, Beatrice prepared for bed. As she slipped beneath the quilt, her mind replayed the events of the day, her terrifying hours lost in the desert, the sheriff's timely arrival, and the strange connection she felt to this man she barely knew. Then you've found me, and that's enough for now." His words echoed in her memory as sleep finally claimed her. His blue eyes the last image in her mind before dreams took her far from Silver Creek. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the window and the sounds of a town already bustling with activity. Beatrice dressed in her own clothes, now cleaned and mended, grateful to reclaim this small piece of her identity. Mrs. Patterson had thoughtfully provided a basin of fresh water, and after washing her face and arranging her hair in a simple but neat style, Beatrice felt prepared to face her first official day in Silver Creek. Breakfast in the hotel dining room introduced her to several more townspeople, each eager to welcome the new schoolteacher. The local merchant, Mr. Gunderson, assured her that his store carried writing supplies and primers that the previous town council had ordered. The blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Reeves, proudly informed her that their twin daughters would be starting school that year. Beatrice greeted each introduction with polite enthusiasm, though she silently wondered if she would ever remember all these new names and faces. To her disappointment, Xavier Morgan did not appear during breakfast. When she casually inquired about his absence, Mrs. Patterson explained that the sheriff often took his morning meal at the small cafe next to his office, especially after nights when the jail cells were occupied. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mayor Clarkson, a portly man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive gold watch chain stretched across his vest, arrived to escort Beatrice to the schoolhouse. As they walked down the main street, he pointed out the various establishments with the obvious pride of a man who considered the town's growth his personal achievement. "Silver Creek's not just some mining camp or cow town, Miss Sawyer," he explained. "We're building a proper community here. That's why education is so important to our future." "I couldn't agree more, Mayor," Beatrice replied sincerely. They turned off the main street onto a smaller road that led toward a whitewashed building set apart from the others. Beatrice's heart quickened at the sight of it, a simple but charming schoolhouse with a small bell tower atop the roof. Behind it stood an even smaller structure that must be her new home. A group of men waited on the schoolhouse steps, and Beatrice was surprised to see Xavier among them. Unlike the others in their formal attire, he wore his usual working clothes, though he'd added a jacket over his vest. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod but no smile. "Ah, the welcoming committee is all here," Mayor Clarkson announced cheerfully. "Miss Sawyer, allow me to introduce Judge Holloway, who oversees legal matters for the entire county." A tall, distinguished gentleman with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes stepped forward to shake her hand. "Miss Sawyer, your arrival is most welcome. I've long believed that civilization follows education, not the other way around." "Thank you, Your Honor," Beatrice replied, liking him immediately. The introductions continued: Mr. Fitzgerald the banker, Reverend Johnson from the church doctor, Harper, who served as the town's only physician, and finally the two women on the town council. Mrs. Whitman, who ran the general store with her husband, and Mrs. Jenkins, who had been teaching the children until Beatrice's arrival. "And of course, you've already met Sheriff Morgan," Mayor Clarkson concluded. "Miss Sawyer," Xavier acknowledged formally, his manner more reserved than it had been the previous day. "Sheriff," she returned with equal formality, wondering at the change. Judge Holloway produced a large iron key from his pocket. "Shall we show you your new domain, Miss Sawyer?" The schoolhouse interior exceeded Beatrice's expectations. Though simple, the room was large and airy, with tall windows allowing plenty of natural light. Rows of sturdy desks faced a raised platform where the teacher's desk stood. A large blackboard covered most of the front wall, and bookshelves sparsely filled but with space for many more volumes lined the back. The town contributed what books they could spare, Mrs. Jenkins explained, noticing Beatrice's attention to the shelves. Mostly Bibles and a few classics. Judge Holloway donated a set of encyclopedias. "This is wonderful," Beatrice said, running her hand along the smooth surface of her desk. A wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm her. This space, this opportunity, represented everything she'd hoped for when fleeing Boston. "We'll leave you to get acquainted with the schoolhouse," Judge Holloway said kindly. "Mrs. Jenkins can answer any questions about the curriculum thus far. Sheriff Morgan will show you to your quarters when you're ready." The council members filed out, leaving only Mrs. Jenkins, Xavier, and Beatrice in the schoolroom. "I've kept simple records of each child's progress, Mrs. Jenkins said, opening a drawer in the desk and removing a leather-bound ledger. "I'm afraid my methods have been rather informal, most of my efforts focused on reading and basic arithmetic." "I'm sure you've done admirably," Beatrice assured her, accepting the ledger. "I'll build upon the foundation you've established," Mrs. Jenkins beamed at the compliment. "The children are eager to meet you. Word of your arrival has spread through town like wildfire. I suspect you'll have a full house come Monday morning." After a few more minutes of conversation about individual students and their particular needs or challenges, Mrs. Jenkins excused herself, claiming household duties required her attention. As the door closed behind her, Beatrice became acutely aware of Xavier's silent presence near the back of the room. "You've been very quiet, Sheriff," she observed, turning to face him. Xavier moved forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Just observing," he said. "You seem pleased with the arrangements." "Very much so," Beatrice confirmed. "The town has been extraordinarily welcoming." "Silver Creek's been waiting a long time for a proper teacher," he said, stopping a few feet from her. "Though I should warn you, they may have certain expectations about your personal conduct as well as your teaching abilities." Beatrice felt a chill at his words. "What sort of expectations?" "Small towns have long memories and strict notions of propriety," Xavier replied, his blue eyes studying her face. "The teacher sets an example not just in the classroom but in all aspects of life. There will be scrutiny." Was he warning her or testing her? Beatrice couldn't be certain, but something in his manner suggested he knew more about her than he should, or was trying to determine if there were secrets to discover. "I assure you, Sheriff Morgan, I understand the responsibilities of my position," she said carefully. He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded. "Good." Moving toward the rear door of the schoolhouse, he added, "Your quarters are this way if you'd like to see them now." The small house behind the schoolhouse was indeed modest, but to Beatrice, it represented freedom. A combined sitting room and kitchen occupied the front half, with a cast-iron stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. A door led to the bedroom, which contained a simple bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. The furnishings were basic but sturdy, and someone had placed a vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table. "Mrs. Whitman arranged for basic provisions," Xavier explained, indicating a small pantry where Beatrice could see staples like flour, coffee, and sugar. "The town will provide a monthly stipend for additional necessities." "It's perfect," Beatrice said sincerely, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table. "More than I hoped for." Xavier watched her with that same inscrutable expression he'd worn in the schoolhouse. "Most people want more than this," he observed. Beatrice met his gaze directly. "Perhaps I've learned that more isn't always better, Sheriff Morgan." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, though his mouth remained serious. "Xavier," he said quietly. "When we're not in official capacity, you can call me Xavier." The simple offer of his given name felt unexpectedly intimate. "Beatrice," she returned with a small smile. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with something Beatrice couldn't quite name. Then Xavier cleared his throat and moved toward the door. "I should return to my duties," he said, his formal manner reasserting itself. "Town council's arranged for your belongings to be delivered from the hotel this afternoon. If you need anything else, my office is just off the main street next to the cafe." "Thank you," Beatrice said, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "For everything?" Xavier paused at the threshold, looking back at her with an expression that might have been regret. "Just doing my job, Miss Sawyer," he replied, echoing his words from the previous day before stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Alone in her new home, Beatrice sank into the rocking chair and tried to sort through her jumbled emotions. Relief at having reached her destination safely. Excitement about beginning her teaching duties. gratitude for the town's warm welcome, and something more complex, where Xavier Morgan was concerned an inexplicable pull toward a man who seemed determined to maintain his distance today, despite the connection she'd felt forming between them during her rescue. What had changed? Was it merely the transition from rescuer and rescued to their formal roles as sheriff and schoolteacher? Or had he somehow learned something about her past that made him wary? The thought sent a spike of anxiety through her. She'd come to Silver Creek to escape the scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Boston, her broken engagement to Charles Blackwood after discovering his affair with her cousin. The subsequent rumors, mostly false but devastating nonetheless, had made her continued presence in Boston society untenable. No one in Silver Creek could possibly know about that. Could they? Pushing aside her concerns, Beatrice rose and began exploring her new home more thoroughly. Whatever Xavier Morgan's reasons for his reserve, she had a life to build here, a purpose that went beyond any personal complications. The children of Silver Creek needed a teacher, and she intended to be the best they'd ever had. By Monday morning, Beatrice had settled into her small house and prepared the schoolroom for her first day of teaching. Her few belongings, books, clothing, and personal mementos had been delivered as promised, and she'd spent Sunday creating lesson plans based on Mrs. Jenkins' notes about each student's abilities. She arrived at the schoolhouse an hour before classes were to begin, lighting the stove to ward off the early morning chill and writing the day's lessons on the blackboard. As she worked, her mind kept returning to Xavier Morgan. She hadn't seen him since he'd shown her the house, though she'd heard his name mentioned frequently during her introductions around town. Everyone seemed to respect the sheriff, but few spoke of him with genuine warmth or affection. He was, as Mrs. Patterson had put it, a man who keeps his own counsel. The sound of approaching voices interrupted her thoughts. Looking out the window, Beatrice saw a group of children making their way toward the schoolhouse, some accompanied by parents, others walking in small groups. Taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, she smoothed her dress and prepared to greet her new students. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions, assessments, and establishing classroom routines. The 28 students ranged widely in both age and academic preparation. Some of the older children could read fluently and calculate basic sums, while others, particularly those who worked alongside their parents during planting and harvest seasons, had significant educational gaps. Most surprising to Beatrice were the 3 Apache children who arrived mid-morning, escorted by a striking woman in traditional dress who introduced herself as Morning Star. Her English was formal but fluent as she explained that her children, 2 boys and a girl, would attend school 3 days each week. Judge Holloway has arrangement with our chief, she explained. Children learn white man's words and numbers, return to teach others. They're very welcome, Beatrice assured her, though she noticed several of the town children watching the exchange with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Addressing this division would clearly be one of her first challenges. By the time the noon recess arrived, Beatrice had established a preliminary organization of the students into groups based on their abilities rather than strictly by age. As the children scattered outside to eat their packed lunches, she sank into her chair, suddenly aware of how tense her shoulders had become. A knock at the door roused her. Looking up, she was surprised to see Xavier standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the empty classroom. "Sheriff Morgan," she greeted him, rising quickly. "What brings you to the schoolhouse?" "Just checking that your first morning went smoothly," he replied, remaining near the threshold as though reluctant to enter her domain. "The children seem eager to learn," Beatrice said, moving toward him, "though I've noticed some tension between the town children and the Apache students." Xavier's expression darkened. "That's to be expected. There's been peace with the local tribe for almost 5 years now, but memories run long on both sides. Judge Holloway's integration efforts are not universally popular." "Well, I intend to support them fully," Beatrice stated firmly. "Education should be available to all children, regardless of background. A hint of a smile touched Xavier's lips. You may find that progressive thinking doesn't always translate easily to frontier realities, Miss Sawyer. Beatrice, she reminded him, lowering her voice slightly. And I'm not afraid of difficult translations, Xavier. His eyes widened fractionally at her directness, and for a moment she thought she glimpsed something like admiration in them. Then his professional mask slipped back into place. Mayor Clarkson asked me to inform you that there will be a social at the church this Saturday evening, he said. Sort of an official welcome for the new teacher. Your attendance would be expected. The slight hesitation in his voice caught her attention. Is that an invitation or a warning, Sheriff? Xavier glanced over his shoulder at the schoolyard where the children played, then stepped further into the room, closing the distance between them. When he spoke again, his voice was pitched low enough that only she could hear. Both, he admitted. The social is genuine, the town wants to welcome you properly, but it's also your first public presentation as Silver Creek's teacher. First impressions matter here. Beatrice studied him, trying to understand the concern evident in his manner. You seem troubled by this. Xavier ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. I just want you to be prepared. Questions will be asked about your background, your family, why you chose to come west alone. The implication was clear her past would be scrutinized. Are you asking what they'll find if they dig, Sheriff? Their eyes locked, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. I'm offering you a chance to tell me yourself, he said quietly. Before rumors start, Beatrice's heart pounded in her chest. How much should she reveal? She hadn't done anything truly shameful, but small towns had their own moral codes, their own ways of judging a woman's worth. I was engaged, she said finally, deciding that a partial truth was better than an outright lie. The engagement ended badly. Boston society has little tolerance for a woman jilted at the altar, even when the man proved himself unworthy of the commitment. Xavier's expression remained neutral, but she noticed his hands had clenched slightly at his sides. He hurt you, not physically, Beatrice clarified quickly. But yes, in other ways. And that's why you came west, to escape gossip, partially, she admitted. But also because I wanted something more than the life laid out for me in Boston. Teaching here offers purpose, independence, things I value more than society's approval. Xavier searched her face as though looking for deception, then nodded slowly. Fair enough, but you should know secrets have a way of finding daylight in places like Silver Creek. If there's more to the story, it might be better coming from you than from an Eastern newspaper or a traveler with loose lips. Before Beatrice could respond, the school bell rang, signaling the end of recess. Xavier stepped back, his professional demeanor firmly in place once more. Thank you for the invitation to the social, Beatrice said formally as children began filing back into the classroom. I look forward to it. Xavier tipped his hat to her, then to the curious students watching their interaction. Good day, Miss Sawyer. As he left, Beatrice tried to focus on her afternoon lessons, but her mind kept returning to their conversation. Xavier clearly suspected there was more to her story than she'd revealed, and he wasn't wrong. The question was whether the truth would eventually find its way to Silver Creek, and what would happen to her new beginning if it did. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of teaching, planning lessons, and gradually getting to know the townspeople. Beatrice found herself settling into a routine, rising early to prepare for the day, teaching until mid-afternoon, then using the remaining daylight hours to visit students' homes, shop for necessities, or simply explore her new community. To her mild disappointment, she saw little of Xavier during this time. Occasionally, she spotted him patrolling the main street or emerging from his office, but their interactions were limited to polite nods from a distance. Whatever connection had sparked between them during her rescue seemed to have been deliberately dampened by his professional reserve. By Saturday evening, Beatrice had convinced herself that her initial attraction to the sheriff had been nothing more than gratitude combined with the heightened emotions of her rescue. As she prepared for the church social, Selecting her best dress, a modest blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, she resolved to focus on establishing herself as Silver Creek's teacher rather than dwelling on confusing feelings for a man who clearly wished to maintain his distance. The social proved to be a larger affair than Beatrice had anticipated. It seemed the entire town had crowded into the church hall, which had been decorated with wildflowers and paper streamers. A small group of musicians played lively tunes in one corner, while tables laden with food and drink lined the walls. Children darted between groups of adults, their usual social hierarchies temporarily forgotten in the excitement of the celebration. Mayor Clarkson immediately took it upon himself to formally introduce Beatrice to anyone she hadn't yet met, parading her around the room like a prized exhibit. She smiled graciously through each introduction, doing her best to remember names and connections in the complex web of Silver Creek society. "Miss Sawyer has already made an impressive start with our children," the mayor announced to a group of ranchers and their wives. "My own grandson Timothy can't stop talking about her lessons on American history. We're certainly blessed to have such a cultured lady willing to come all the way from Boston," Mrs. Gunderson added, eyeing Beatrice's dress with open admiration. "Did you study teaching formally, Miss Sawyer?" "I attended the Boston Female Seminary," Beatrice explained. "Though much of my experience comes from tutoring my younger cousins and neighborhood children." "And your family," another woman prompted, "were they supportive of your decision to move west?" The question, innocent on its surface, reminded Beatrice of Xavier's warning. These casual inquiries were the beginning of the scrutiny he'd predicted. "My parents are both deceased," she replied carefully. "My father was a textile merchant who passed away last winter. My mother died when I was quite young. No brothers or sisters," the woman persisted. "I'm an only child. And no husband or fiancé left behind in Boston." This came from a younger woman whose expression suggested more than casual interest in the answer. Beatrice felt a flush creep up her neck. No fiancé," she said, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. "Well, you won't lack for suitors here," Mayor Clarkson declared with a hearty laugh. "Half the unmarried men in the county are finding reasons to visit Silver Creek since word spread of our beautiful new schoolteacher." The group chuckled, but Beatrice noticed several of the women exchanging knowing glances. She was being evaluated not just as a teacher, but as a potential wife for brothers, sons, or friends, a common enough practice in small communities, but one that made her distinctly uncomfortable given her recent experience. Before the conversation could become more personal, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Xavier had arrived, and like Beatrice, he had dressed for the occasion. His usual working clothes had been replaced by a dark suit and crisp white shirt, and he'd tamed his unruly hair. The transformation was striking from rugged lawman to distinguished gentleman with just a change of attire. The effect on the room was immediate. Conversations paused, and several young women visibly brightened at his entrance. Even more telling was the way certain men, particularly those who had been enjoying the refreshment punch with perhaps too much enthusiasm, suddenly straightened their postures and adopted more sober expressions. Xavier scanned the room, his gaze eventually finding Beatrice among the crowd. For a moment their eyes held, and she felt that same inexplicable connection that had formed during her rescue. Then Mayor Clarkson was calling him over, breaking the moment. "Sheriff, come meet our guests of honor. Though I suppose you and Miss Sawyer are already acquainted, given your heroic rescue." Xavier approached their group, his expression carefully neutral. "Mayor," he acknowledged with a nod before turning to Beatrice. "Miss Sawyer, you seem to be settling in well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of the many eyes watching their interaction. "The town has been most welcoming." Indeed," Mayor Clarkson interjected. "And speaking of welcomes, I believe it's time for the official presentation. If you'll excuse us, ladies and gentlemen." Before Beatrice could protest, the mayor was guiding her toward the front of the hall, where Judge Holloway waited beside a cloth-covered object on a small table. The music stopped, and the crowd's attention turned toward them. "Friends and neighbors," Judge Holloway began once the room had quieted, We gather tonight to officially welcome Miss Beatrice Sawyer to Silver Creek. In her first week as our schoolteacher, she has already demonstrated the knowledge, patience, and dedication we hoped to find when we sent our advertisement east. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Beatrice felt a wave of gratitude for their warm reception. Education is the foundation upon which civilization stands, the judge continued. In providing our children with knowledge, we build not just their futures but the future of Silver Creek itself. He turned to Beatrice with a genuine smile. Miss Sawyer, on behalf of the town council and all the citizens of Silver Creek, we present you with this token of our appreciation and support. He pulled away the cloth to reveal a handsome brass bell mounted on a wooden base. A small plaque affixed to the base read, "Presented to Miss Beatrice Sawyer, first schoolteacher of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, 1876. Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes as she accepted the gift. "I'm deeply honored," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I promise to serve the children of Silver Creek with all my heart and ability." Applause erupted, and for a moment, Beatrice felt truly at home among these people who had welcomed her so generously. As the music resumed and the crowd dispersed back to their conversations and refreshments, she found herself searching the room for Xavier. He stood near the back wall, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, pride, perhaps, mixed with something more complex. Before she could make her way toward him, she was intercepted by a tall, sandy-haired man with an engaging smile. "Miss Sawyer," he greeted her, extending his hand. "Thomas Bradley. I own the Double B Ranch about 10 miles south of town. My nephew Billy speaks very highly of your teaching." "Mr. Bradley," Beatrice acknowledged, accepting his handshake. "Billy is a bright boy with a particular aptitude for mathematics." "Is he now?" Bradley's smile widened. "His mother, my sister, will be pleased to hear that. She's always maintained the boy had a good head for figures." He gestured toward the refreshment table. "May I get you some punch?" "Thank you, that would be lovely," Beatrice replied, recognizing the social obligation to accept such courtesies even as she noted the interested glances their interaction was receiving from nearby matrons. As Bradley moved toward the refreshments, Beatrice became aware of Xavier approaching from the opposite direction. "Congratulations on your presentation," he said, his formal tone at odds with the warmth in his eyes. The bell was Judge Holloway's idea. "It's beautiful," Beatrice replied sincerely. "I'm touched by the gesture." Xavier glanced toward the refreshment table where Bradley was filling 2 cups. "I see you've met Tom Bradley." Something in his voice made Beatrice look at him more closely. "Yes, just now. He mentioned his nephew as my student." "Bradley owns the largest cattle operation in the county," Xavier said neutrally. "Widower, no children of his own, but he's raised his nephew since his sister was widowed 2 years ago." The information was delivered casually, but Beatrice sensed an underlying message. "I see. Is there something about Mr. Bradley I should know, Sheriff?" Xavier's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just providing context, Miss Sawyer, Bradley is well respected in the territory. Serves as a county commissioner, has the governor's ear on matters affecting the ranching community." Before Beatrice could respond to this oblique assessment, Bradley returned with 2 cups of punch. If he was surprised to find the sheriff conversing with Beatrice, he didn't show it. "Morgan," he greeted Xavier with a friendly nod. "Keeping our school teacher out of trouble?" "Miss Sawyer seems quite capable of managing her own affairs," Xavier replied, his tone cordial but cool. Bradley laughed. "Indeed she does. Still, it must be reassuring to have our stalwart sheriff looking out for her welfare." He handed Beatrice a cup of punch. "The music's quite good tonight. Perhaps later you might consider honoring me with a dance, Miss Sawyer." The invitation was delivered with such charm that Beatrice found herself smiling despite her awareness of Xavier's suddenly rigid posture beside her. "Perhaps, Mr. Bradley, though I should warn you, I'm not particularly accomplished at Western dances." "I'd be happy to teach you," Bradley offered. "The steps are simple enough once you get the rhythm." "If you'll excuse me," Xavier cut in, his expression unreadable, "I should check on things outside. Enjoy your evening, Miss Sawyer." Bradley Without waiting for a response, he turned and made his way through the crowd toward the exit. Beatrice watched him go, a mixture of confusion and disappointment settling in her chest. "Don't mind Morgan," Bradley said, misinterpreting her expression. "He takes his duties seriously, sometimes too seriously for social gatherings." Beatrice forced her attention back to her companion. "He seems very dedicated to the town's safety." "Oh, no question about his dedication," Bradley agreed readily. "Morgan's been sheriff here since '73. Came from somewhere back east, originally Virginia, I think after the war. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a man in the territory who'd want to be on the wrong side of his gun." The casual mention of violence reminded Beatrice once again of the very real dangers that lurked beneath the surface of frontier life. Xavier Morgan wasn't just the reserved, enigmatic man who had rescued her and sparked unfamiliar feelings. He was a man accustomed to confronting violence, perhaps even dispensing it when necessary. The thought should have disturbed her more than it did. For the remainder of the evening, Beatrice circulated among the townspeople, accepting their well wishes and answering the seemingly endless questions about her background and experiences. She did eventually dance with Thomas Bradley, finding him to be an amiable partner and patient instructor in the unfamiliar steps. Several other men also claimed dances, and by the time the social began to wind down, Beatrice had been formally introduced to virtually every eligible bachelor within 20 miles of Silver Creek. Xavier did not return to the hall, a fact that bothered Beatrice more than she cared to admit, even to herself. As the evening concluded and people began to depart, Judge Holloway approached her. "I hope you've enjoyed your welcome celebration, Miss Sawyer." "Very much, Your Honor," she assured him. "Everyone has been incredibly kind." The judge studied her with keen eyes that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. "I noticed Sheriff Morgan departed rather early. I hope there wasn't any discomfort." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm at the perceptive question. "Not at all. I believe he mentioned needing to check on something outside." Judge Holloway's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation. "Xavier Morgan is a good man," he said after a brief pause. "One of the best I've known, in fact, but he carries burdens that make him cautious in matters of the heart." Beatrice's eyes widened at the unexpected direction of the conversation. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor," the judge smiled kindly. "Perhaps not yet. But I've observed how he looks at you when he thinks no one notices." He patted her hand in an almost fatherly gesture. "Just remember that sometimes the most valuable treasures are those that require the most patience to uncover." Before Beatrice could formulate a response to this cryptic advice, Mayor Clarkson approached to inform her that he'd arranged for one of the town councilmen to escort her home. With a significant glance that suggested they might continue their conversation another time, Judge Holloway excused himself, leaving Beatrice with even more questions about the enigmatic sheriff who seemed to occupy an increasing portion of her thoughts. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as autumn painted the surrounding hills with splashes of gold and crimson. Beatrice found genuine fulfillment in her teaching duties, watching as her students, even the most reluctant learners, began to show progress. The three Apache children proved to be among her brightest pupils, their natural intelligence and determination helping them overcome the language barrier that initially challenged them. Life in Silver Creek suited Beatrice better than she'd dared hope. The independence she'd craved in Boston was hers at last, along with a sense of purpose and community that had been missing from her previous existence. She developed friendships with several of the town's women, particularly Mrs. Harper, the doctor's wife, whose progressive views on women's education aligned with Beatrice's own. Only one aspect of her new life remained unsettled: her complicated feelings for Xavier Morgan. Since the night of the social, their interactions had been polite but minimal, usually limited to brief exchanges when they happened to cross paths in town. Yet Beatrice often caught him watching her from a distance, his blue eyes intense before he would turn away, as though fighting some internal battle she couldn't comprehend. Thomas Bradley, meanwhile, had become a regular visitor to Silver Creek, often timing his business in town to coincide with the end of the school day. His interest in Beatrice was obvious to everyone, including Beatrice herself, who found his attentions flattering if not entirely stirring. Bradley was handsome, successful, and by all accounts a good man, exactly the sort of suitor her father would have approved of in Boston. Yet whenever he escorted her on walks through town or joined her for tea at the hotel dining room, Beatrice couldn't help comparing his easy charm to Xavier's compelling intensity. It was during one such afternoon, as Bradley walked her home from school, that Beatrice first noticed the stranger watching them from the shadows beside the general store. Something about his furtive manner sent a chill down her spine, though she couldn't have explained why. Is something wrong? Bradley asked, noting her sudden tension. "That man," Beatrice said quietly, nodding toward the store, "the one in the gray coat, he seems to be watching us." Bradley glanced casually in the indicated direction, then frowned. "I don't recognize him, probably just passing through." But there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't as unconcerned as he pretended to be. When they reached her small house, Bradley surprised her by asking to check inside before leaving her. "Just a precaution," he said with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Strangers in town sometimes bring trouble. Though Beatrice thought the measure excessive, she allowed it, watching as Bradley quickly but thoroughly inspected her modest home before pronouncing it secure. "I have some business with the sheriff," he said as he prepared to leave. "I'll mention the stranger to him. Morgan likes to know about unfamiliar faces in his town." After Bradley's departure, Beatrice tried to dismiss her unease as she prepared her evening meal and reviewed student work. But as darkness fell, she found herself checking that her doors and windows were securely latched, a precaution she hadn't felt necessary since her first nights in Silver Creek. She was just preparing for bed when a soft knock at her door startled her. Cautiously approaching, she called out, "Who is it?" "Xavier Morgan," came the reply, his deep voice instantly recognizable. Relief flooded through her as she unlocked and opened the door. Xavier stood on her small porch, hat in hand, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from her doorway. "I apologize for the late hour," he said formally. "Bradley mentioned you noticed someone watching you today." "Yes, a man I didn't recognize," Beatrice confirmed, suddenly conscious of her loosened hair and dressing gown covered hastily with a shawl. "Near the general store this afternoon." Xavier's gaze was intense as he studied her face. "Can you describe him?" "Medium height, thin build." "Gray coat, dark hat pulled low. I couldn't see his face clearly." Xavier nodded, his jaw tightening. "Have you noticed anyone else unfamiliar watching you recently, or received any unusual correspondence?" The question sent a fresh wave of unease through Beatrice. "No, nothing like that." "Should I be concerned?" Xavier hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "It's probably nothing," he said finally, "but I'd like you to be cautious for the next few days. Don't go anywhere alone after dark and keep your doors locked." "You're frightening me, Xavier," Beatrice said quietly. "If there's a specific threat, I'd rather know about it." He ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture of internal conflict. "There's no specific threat that I know of," he assured her. "But my job is to notice patterns, and there have been reports of a man matching that description in several towns along the stage route, asking questions about new arrivals from back east." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. Could someone from Boston be looking for her? Charles wouldn't bother, he'd likely been relieved when she disappeared from society. But his family, particularly his mother who had been humiliated by the broken engagement, might be vindictive enough to send someone to track her down. Xavier noticed her reaction immediately. "You have an idea who might be looking for you." It wasn't a question, and Beatrice didn't bother denying it. "Possibly," she admitted. "Though I can't imagine why anyone would go to such lengths." Xavier's expression darkened. "That partial truth we discussed before the social, is there more I should know now?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice knew she should tell him everything about Charles Blackwood, the broken engagement, the vicious rumors that followed. If someone had indeed tracked her to Silver Creek, those stories would emerge regardless. But fear held her back, fear that once Xavier knew the full story, whatever tenuous connection existed between them would shatter completely. "It's complicated," she said finally, the inadequacy of the response obvious even to her own ears. Xavier studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, his expression closing. "I'll increase patrols around the school and your home for the next few days," he said, his tone purely professional once more. "If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, send word to me immediately." "Thank you," Beatrice replied, suddenly desperate to bridge the distance her evasion had created. "Xavier, good night, Miss Sawyer," he interrupted, settling his hat back on his head and turning to leave. Beatrice watched him walk away, his straight back and measured stride revealing nothing of his thoughts. Only when he had disappeared into the darkness did she close and lock her door, leaning against it as a single tear slipped down her cheek. Whatever fragile thing had been growing between them seemed to be withering under the weight of her secrets. And now, with the possibility that her past was literally pursuing her to Silver Creek, Beatrice wondered how much longer she could maintain the peaceful new life she'd begun to build. The next morning dawned cold and clear, with the first real bite of approaching winter in the air. Beatrice arrived at the schoolhouse early, as was her custom, and was surprised to find Xavier waiting on the steps. He wore his working clothes, including the heavy coat she'd noticed him using on particularly cold mornings, and his expression was grim. "Sheriff," she greeted him formally, conscious of potential observers even at this early hour. "Is something wrong?" "Inside," he said simply, holding the door for her. Once they were in the schoolroom with the door closed, Xavier's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I located the man you saw yesterday," he informed her. "Arrested him last night at the hotel for disorderly conduct after he had too much to drink at the saloon." Relief flooded through Beatrice. "That's good news, isn't it? Was he dangerous?" "Not in the way I feared," Xavier replied, studying her reaction carefully. "His name is James Caldwell. Claims to be a private investigator from Chicago." Beatrice's relief evaporated instantly. "A private investigator, looking for me?" "He wouldn't say who hired him or why," Xavier continued, "but he had a detailed description of you and knew you'd come from Boston on the Central Pacific route." Beatrice sank into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Xavier moved closer, his expression softening further at her obvious distress. "Beatrice," he said gently, "whatever you're running from, I can't help you if I don't know what it is." The use of her given name, combined with the genuine concern in his voice, broke through the last of her resistance. Taking a deep breath, Beatrice met his gaze directly. "I was engaged to a man named Charles Blackwood," she began, the name bitter on her tongue. "His family is prominent in Boston society, old money, political connections. The match was considered ideal, arranged primarily by my father, who hoped the connection would save our failing business." Xavier listened silently, his blue eyes never leaving her face. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered Charles had been carrying on an affair with my cousin Elizabeth, had been for months, even as our engagement was announced and celebrated." Beatrice's voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "When I confronted him, he was cruel. Said he'd never intended to be faithful, that our marriage was a business arrangement, nothing more." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to tell the story at her own pace. "I broke the engagement immediately," Beatrice continued. "Charles was furious not because he cared for me, but because I had humiliated him by being the one to end things. His family was equally outraged. Within days, rumors began circulating through Boston society, vicious stories suggesting I'd been unfaithful, that I'd been caught in compromising positions with multiple men, that the real reason for the broken engagement was my own immoral behavior." "And none of it was true," Xavier said quietly. "None of it," Beatrice confirmed, "but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Former friends avoided me. Invitations ceased. My father's already struggling business lost what few clients remained loyal to us." He died 3 months later, heart failure, the doctor said, but I believe it was really the shame and financial ruin that killed him. Xavier took a step closer, his expression a mixture of anger and compassion. And that's why you came west, to escape the rumors. To start over, Beatrice corrected him. To build a life based on what I could contribute, not on society's judgments or family connections. She looked around the schoolroom at the neat rows of desks and the lessons she'd prepared on the blackboard. I thought I'd found that here. You have, Xavier insisted, surprising her with the fierceness in his tone. Whatever Blackwood's family is trying to do, they must have hired the investigator, Beatrice interrupted, the realization dawning on her with sickening clarity. To track me down, but why? They won. Charles married Elizabeth just a month after our engagement ended. I left Boston. What more could they want? Xavier's expression darkened further. Some people aren't satisfied until they've completely destroyed those they see as enemies. The bell outside began to ring, signaling that students would soon arrive. Beatrice rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. What happens now? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. I still have Caldwell in a cell, Xavier replied. I can hold him another day or two on the drunk and disorderly charge, but eventually I'll have to release him unless he commits another offense. And then he'll report back to whoever hired him, Beatrice said, resignation settling over her. They'll know where I am. Xavier moved suddenly, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. The unexpectedness of the contact startled her into meeting his gaze. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and intense. You've done nothing wrong. You have every right to be here to teach these children, to build whatever life you want. I won't let anyone take that from you. The conviction in his voice, the fierce protectiveness, sent a wave of emotion through Beatrice that momentarily robbed her of speech. In that moment, with his hands warm around hers and his blue eyes blazing with determination, she realized with startling clarity that what she felt for Xavier Morgan had grown far beyond attraction or gratitude. Before she could respond, the schoolhouse door swung open as the first students arrived. Xavier released her hands and stepped back, his sheriff's demeanor falling back into place so quickly that Beatrice might have imagined the intensity of the previous moment if not for the lingering warmth in her fingers. Good morning, children, he greeted the students with a nod. Just checking in with Miss Sawyer about some town business. To Beatrice, he added more formally, I'll keep you informed of any developments, Miss Sawyer. As he left, tipping his hat to several more arriving students, Beatrice fought to compose herself. Whatever happened with the investigator, whatever her feelings for Xavier, might be she had a classroom full of children counting on her. Drawing a deep breath, she forced a smile and turned to greet her students, determined not to let her personal troubles interfere with her duties. The day passed with agonizing slowness, as Beatrice struggled to focus on her teaching, while her mind continually returned to the threat represented by James Caldwell. By the time she dismissed the children in the afternoon, her nerves were so frayed that the simple act of erasing the blackboard left her hands trembling. She was just locking the schoolhouse when Thomas Bradley appeared, his usual cheerful expression replaced by concern. Miss Sawyer, he greeted her. I heard about the investigator Morgan arrested. Are you all right? Beatrice managed a weak smile, touched by his concern even as she wondered how news of Caldwell's identity had spread so quickly. I'm fine, Mr. Bradley, thank you, just a bit unsettled. Bradley offered his arm, which she accepted gratefully. Allow me to walk you home, he said. I've some business with the blacksmith that can wait. As they walked toward her small house, Bradley maintained a stream of inconsequential conversation that required little response from Beatrice, allowing her to gather her thoughts. Only when they reached her door did he address the situation directly. Morgan seems to think this investigator was specifically looking for you, he said carefully. Is there trouble from your past that's followed you here? The question was gently asked, but Beatrice recognized its significance. If she confirmed Bradley's suspicions, she would be admitting to having concealed aspects of her history, a revelation that could potentially damage her standing in the community. "It's a misunderstanding," she replied, choosing her words with care. "A family matter that I believed was resolved before I left Boston." Bradley studied her face, and Beatrice had the uncomfortable feeling that he was evaluating her response against some internal standard. After a moment, he nodded. "Well, whatever it is, you should know you have friends here." "Myself included." "Thank you," Beatrice said sincerely. "That means a great deal to me." Bradley hesitated, then added, "I don't mean to speak out of turn, but you might consider that Morgan's interest in this matter may be more personal than professional." Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm not sure what you mean." A sad smile crossed Bradley's features. "I think you do, Miss Sawyer, and while I admire Morgan as a lawman, his past makes him complicated where relationships are concerned." His past. Beatrice couldn't help asking, curiosity overcoming her embarrassment at the directness of the conversation. Bradley shook his head. "It's not my story to tell, but perhaps you should ask him about Sarah Morgan sometime." With a tip of his hat, he added, "Good evening, Miss Sawyer. Lock your door." Left alone with this cryptic advice, Beatrice entered her house and mechanically prepared a simple supper, her mind racing. Who was Sarah Morgan? Xavier's sister? A former sweetheart? Or the possibility sent a pang through her heart, a wife? Before she could dwell further on the question, a knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Half expecting to find Bradley returned with some forgotten point, she was surprised to see Xavier standing on her porch instead, his expression grim. "May I come in?" he asked, removing his hat. "There's been a development." Beatrice stepped aside, suddenly fearful. "What's happened?" Xavier entered, his tall frame seeming to fill her small sitting room. "Caldwell's gone," he said without preamble. "Someone helped him escape from the jail while I was making rounds this afternoon." "Escaped," Beatrice repeated, her voice faint. "But how?" "Back window bars were sawed through," Xavier replied, his frustration evident. "Clean job, done by someone who knew what they were doing. Must have had help waiting with horses. They were gone before my deputy noticed the empty cell." Beatrice sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "So he's free to report back to whoever hired him?" "Yes," Xavier confirmed, pacing the small space between her table and the stove. "But that's not what concerns me most. Jailbreaks like this aren't common, especially not for a man held on a minor charge who would have been released within days anyway." Understanding dawned slowly. "You think whoever broke him out wants more than information?" Xavier stopped pacing to look directly at her. "I think you might be in real danger, Beatrice. Caldwell wasn't just asking questions about you in town yesterday. He was mapping your routine, noting when you're alone." Fear clutched at Beatrice's heart. "You think Charles or his family might want to harm me? That seems extreme even for them." "I don't know," Xavier admitted, "but I'm not willing to risk your safety while we find out." He took a deep breath, as though preparing himself for resistance. "I want you to stay at the jailhouse tonight. There's a small room in the back with a cot, not comfortable but secure. My deputy and I can take shifts watching the main entrance." Beatrice stared at him, processing the suggestion. Spending the night in the town jail, even in a private room, would certainly cause talk. But the alternative was remaining alone in her isolated house, wondering if every sound was Caldwell returning with unknown intentions. "All right," she agreed, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Let me gather a few things." Relief flashed across Xavier's features. "Pack only what you need for tonight. I'll speak with Judge Holloway in the morning about a more permanent solution until we locate Caldwell." As Beatrice moved to her bedroom to collect essential items, she heard Xavier checking the locks on her windows and the back door. The sound should have frightened her, further confirmation that her fears were justified, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. Whatever Xavier's personal feelings toward her might be, his determination to protect her was unmistakable. When she emerged with a small bag containing her nightclothes and toiletries, Xavier was waiting by the front door, his expression once again unreadable. "Ready?" he asked. Beatrice nodded, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, Xavier offered his arm, which she took gratefully. They walked in silence through the quiet streets, Beatrice acutely aware of his vigilance as his gaze constantly scanned their surroundings. The jailhouse was a solid stone building on the main street, its imposing facade designed to discourage exactly the sort of breakout that had occurred that afternoon. Inside, a young man Beatrice recognized as Xavier's deputy sat at a desk, cleaning a revolver with meticulous care. "Evening, Sheriff Miss Sawyer," he greeted them, quickly setting aside the weapon. "Got the back room ready like you asked." "Thank you, Peters," Xavier replied. "Any sign of them?" The deputy shook his head. "Nothing yet. But Johnson at the livery says 2 horses were stolen sometime this afternoon, probably during the church ladies' sewing circle when the street was quiet." Xavier nodded grimly. "That fits. They'll need to move fast if they want to catch tomorrow's eastbound train at Fort Gibson." "You think they're leaving the territory?" Beatrice asked. "If Caldwell's only goal was gathering information, yes," Xavier replied. "He has what he came for: confirmation of your location and situation. No reason to linger where he might be recaptured." "But you're not convinced that was his only goal?" Beatrice guessed, reading the concern in his expression. Xavier exchanged a glance with his deputy before responding. "Let's get you settled first. We can discuss this further once you're comfortable." The back room was indeed small, with just enough space for a narrow cot, a washstand, and a small table with a lamp. But it was clean, and the single window was securely barred, a feature that Beatrice found comforting rather than confining under the circumstances. "It's not much," Xavier said apologetically as she set her bag on the cot. "It's perfect," Beatrice assured him. "Thank you for thinking of this arrangement." Xavier nodded, his gaze lingering on her face as though searching for signs of fear or regret. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he said finally. "Try to get some rest." As he turned to leave, Beatrice found herself calling after him. "Xavier, wait." When he paused, she gathered her courage and asked, "Who is Sarah Morgan?" The effect of the question was immediate and shocking. All color drained from Xavier's face, and his body went rigid, as though he'd been struck a physical blow. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his blue eyes filled with such raw pain that Beatrice immediately regretted her impulsive inquiry. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have." "My wife," Xavier interrupted, his voice barely audible. "Sarah was my wife." The confirmation sent a pang through Beatrice's heart. "I didn't realize you were married." "I'm not," he replied flatly. "Not anymore. Sarah died 5 years ago." The simple statement, delivered with such controlled anguish, told Beatrice everything and nothing. Grief had carved itself into Xavier's features, aging him before her eyes into a man who had known profound loss. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the inadequacy of the words painfully apparent. Xavier's gaze focused on something distant, beyond the walls of the small room. "We came west together after the war," he said, his voice taking on a hollow quality. "I was broken in ways that Virginia couldn't heal. Sarah believed the territories would give us a fresh start." A bitter smile touched his lips. She was always the optimistic one. Beatrice remained silent, instinctively understanding that whatever Xavier was sharing had remained unspoken for a very long time. "We settled near Fort Gibson initially," he continued. "I worked as a scout for the Army while Sarah taught at the mission school. We were happy for almost 3 years. His voice caught on the word happy as though it belonged to a foreign language he no longer spoke fluently. "What happened?" Beatrice asked gently when the silence stretched too long. Xavier's eyes refocused on her face, but she had the sense he was seeing someone else, someone lost to time and tragedy. "Apache raid," he said finally. "I was away, guiding a survey party. By the time I returned, the mission had been burned to the ground. Sarah and 16 others were dead." Horror filled Beatrice at the stark brutality of the story. "Xavier, I hunted them," he interrupted, his voice hardening. "Tracked the war party for 2 months through the mountains. Found them, killed 7 men before the Army patrol caught up and stopped me." His hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "They called it justice. I called it vengeance. Either way, it didn't bring her back." In that moment, Beatrice understood why Xavier had maintained his distance despite the connection they both clearly felt. His past wasn't simply a source of pain, it was a wound that had never properly healed, one that had fundamentally altered how he viewed relationships and attachment. "Is that why you became a sheriff?" she asked softly. "To find a different kind of justice?" Xavier's expression shifted, some of the tension leaving his body. "Judge Holloway found me after it was over. Said I could either drink myself to death like most men would, or I could channel my loss into something constructive." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He can be persuasive when he wants to be. He seems to care about you a great deal," Beatrice observed. "He saved my life," Xavier replied simply. "Not just by giving me the badge, but by believing I was worth saving when I wasn't sure of it myself." The vulnerability in this admission, so at odds with the capable, controlled man she'd come to know, moved Beatrice deeply. Without thinking, she crossed the small room and took his hand in hers. "Thank you for telling me," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I know it wasn't easy." Xavier looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Beatrice thought he might pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened around hers. "I haven't spoken her name aloud in almost 2 years," he admitted quietly. Somehow it felt disloyal to acknowledge her to someone who never knew her. "I don't think it's disloyal to remember those we've lost," Beatrice said gently. "Or to speak of them to those who come after." Xavier studied her face, something shifting in his blue eyes. "You're not what I expected when I found you in the desert that day," he said finally. Before Beatrice could ask what he meant, a shout from the front room shattered the moment. "Sheriff!" Riders coming fast down Main Street. Xavier's demeanor transformed instantly, the vulnerable man replaced by the vigilant lawman. "Stay here," he ordered, releasing her hand and moving swiftly toward the door. "Lock it behind me." As he disappeared into the front office, Beatrice did as instructed, turning the key with trembling fingers. Through the solid door, she could hear Xavier issuing rapid instructions to his deputy, followed by the metallic sound of weapons being readied. Drawing a shaky breath, Beatrice moved away from the door toward the barred window. From this angle, she could see only a narrow slice of the main street, illuminated by scattered lanterns. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then 2 riders appeared in her limited field of vision, their horses lathered from hard riding. To her surprise, she recognized one of the riders as Thomas Bradley. The other man was a stranger, tall and lean, with a distinctive gray coat that identified him immediately as James Caldwell, the investigator who had been watching her. Voices carried through the night air, Xavier's deep, commanding tone ordering the men to dismount slowly, Bradley's response too muffled to distinguish. Beatrice strained to hear more, pressing closer to the window. A sudden movement caught her attention, Caldwell reaching inside his coat with a swift, deliberate motion. Before she could process what was happening, the unmistakable crack of a gunshot split the night. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as chaos erupted outside. More shots followed in rapid succession. Unable to see clearly through the narrow window, she could only listen in horror to the sounds of the confrontation shouts. Another shot, the frightened whinnying of horses. Then silence fell, heavy and terrible. Beatrice stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else. Who had been shot? Was Xavier hurt or worse? The uncertainty was unbearable. Just as she was reaching for the door key, determined to discover what had happened regardless of the danger, footsteps approached from the outer office. A firm knock sounded. "Beatrice, it's me. Open the door." Xavier's voice sent a wave of relief through her so intense that her knees nearly buckled. With shaking hands, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Xavier stood before her, unharmed but for a small cut above his right eyebrow where blood trickled down his temple. His expression was grim, his revolver still in his hand. "Are you all right?" Beatrice asked, fighting the urge to throw her arms around him in sheer gratitude that he was alive. "I'm fine," he assured her, holstering his weapon. "Caldwell drew on us. Bradley tried to stop him and took a bullet in the shoulder, my deputies escorting them both to the doctors." Beatrice struggled to make sense of this information. "Bradley, but why was he with Caldwell? I don't understand." Xavier's expression darkened further. Neither did I until Bradley explained. He's the one who hired Caldwell to find you. The revelation struck Beatrice like a physical blow. What? But that's impossible. He barely knows me. Why would he? Because he knew Charles Blackwood, Xavier interrupted. They attended the same boarding school as boys, remained friends into adulthood. According to Bradley, he received a letter from Blackwood 3 weeks ago asking him to confirm whether you had indeed taken the teaching position in Silver Creek. Beatrice sank onto the cot, her legs no longer able to support her. Charles knew where I was going all along, she whispered. But how? The teaching advertisement, Xavier explained, leaning against the doorframe, his tall frame suddenly seeming weary. It was published in several Eastern newspapers, including the Boston Herald. Blackwood saw it, recognized the opportunity, and reached out to his old friend Bradley, who conveniently owned a ranch near Silver Creek. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. So when Bradley began calling on me, showing interest, he was gathering information for Blackwood, Xavier confirmed grimly. Though to be fair, Bradley claims he genuinely came to admire you during that time. Says that's why he helped break Caldwell out of jail to convince him to leave without completing the second part of his assignment. A cold dread settled in Beatrice's stomach. Second part, what do you mean? Xavier's jaw tightened. According to Bradley, Caldwell wasn't just hired to find you. He was paid to create a scenario that would destroy your reputation here just as it had been destroyed in Boston. Outrage momentarily overcame Beatrice's shock. Charles is still trying to punish me, after all this time, when he's the one who, she broke off, fighting tears of anger and betrayal. Xavier moved from the doorway to sit beside her on the cot, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not quite touching her. Bradley says he didn't know about the second part of the plan until after he'd already helped Caldwell gather information about you. When he realized what Blackwood intended, he tried to buy Caldwell off, offered him more money to leave without completing the job. But Caldwell refused, Beatrice guessed. Apparently, he has a reputation for completing his assignments, Xavier agreed. When bribery didn't work, Bradley broke him out of jail, planning to escort him to the territorial border. What he didn't count on was Caldwell doubling back toward town. To finish the job, Beatrice said, her voice barely audible. Xavier nodded grimly. Bradley realized what was happening and rode after him. They arrived just as my deputy and I were making evening rounds. Beatrice absorbed this information slowly, her mind struggling to reconcile the charming rancher who had courted her so persistently with a man who had been gathering intelligence for her vindictive former fiancé. What happens now? She asked finally. Caldwell's dead, Xavier replied bluntly. Bradley's wounded but will recover and face charges for breaking a prisoner out of my jail, though Judge Holloway will probably show leniency given the circumstances. And me? Beatrice asked, meeting his gaze directly. Once the town hears about all this about my past, the town doesn't need to know the details, Xavier interrupted. Only that an Eastern private investigator with questionable motives was watching you and that he's been dealt with. But Bradley has every reason to keep the full story quiet given his own involvement, Xavier pointed out. And more importantly, Judge Holloway and I believe you've earned your place here, regardless of what drove you west in the first place. The simple declaration, the unquestioning acceptance, broke through Beatrice's carefully maintained composure. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the accumulated tension of the past days finally overwhelmed her. Without a word, Xavier hesitantly placed his arm around her shoulders. When she didn't pull away, he drew her closer, offering silent comfort as she wept. "I'm sorry," she managed finally, embarrassed by her loss of control. You don't need to apologize," Xavier said quietly. "Not to me, not ever." Something in his tone made Beatrice look up, finding his blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, the connection that had sparked during her rescue in the desert now unmistakably strengthened by all they had shared since. "Beatrice," Xavier began, his voice lower, rougher than she'd ever heard it, "I'm not good at this, at feelings." Since Sarah, I haven't allowed myself to, he broke off, clearly struggling to find words. I know, Beatrice said softly, understanding what he couldn't articulate. I haven't exactly had the best experience with matters of the heart either. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Quite a pair we make. Yes, she agreed, finding herself returning the smile despite everything. Quite a pair. Xavier's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned closer. The first brush of his lips against hers was tentative, almost reverent, a question rather than a demand. Beatrice answered by sliding her hands up to his shoulders and returning the kiss with a gentleness that matched his own. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I never expected to find you, he whispered. Never thought I'd feel this way again. When I told you I'd lost my way that day in the desert, Beatrice replied, I didn't know how true that was. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. Xavier pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. And what I said then is still true now, he said, a smile spreading across his features that transformed his entire face. You found me, and that's enough. In the days that followed, Silver Creek buzzed with gossip about the confrontation outside the jailhouse. Various versions of the story circulated, each more dramatic than the last, but the essential facts remained consistent. A private investigator with unknown motives had been watching the schoolteacher, had escaped from jail with help from Thomas Bradley, and had been killed while resisting arrest upon his return to town. To Beatrice's relief, most speculation focused on Caldwell's motives rather than her past. The prevailing theory became that the investigator had mistaken her for someone else, perhaps a wealthy heiress in hiding or a witness to some Eastern crime. A few voices suggested more scandalous possibilities, but Judge Holloway's firm support of Beatrice, combined with Xavier's intimidating presence whenever such rumors arose, quickly dampened the more salacious speculation. Thomas Bradley recovered from his shoulder wound and faced a brief trial before Judge Holloway, who sentenced him to a substantial fine rather than imprisonment for his role in the jailbreak. Before returning to his ranch, Bradley visited Beatrice at the schoolhouse after classes one afternoon. I came to apologize, he said, standing awkwardly before her desk, his arm still in a sling. My actions were unforgivable, but I hope you'll understand I never intended harm to come to you. Beatrice studied him, trying to reconcile this contrite man with both the charming suitor who had courted her and the conspirator who had betrayed her trust. Why did you do it, Mr. Bradley? She asked finally. Why help Charles at all? Bradley sighed, genuine regret in his expression. Misplaced loyalty to an old friendship, I suppose. When I received Charles's letter asking me to confirm your presence here, it seemed a simple enough favor. I didn't know the full story or his true intentions until much later. And yet you continued gathering information about me, even after you suspected his motives weren't honorable. Yes, Bradley admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. By then, I'd convinced myself I was simply being thorough, that once I reported to Charles, the matter would be concluded. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. I was wrong, Miss Sawyer, terribly wrong, and while I know it changes nothing, I want you to know that my admiration for you was genuine, as was my attempt to stop Caldwell from carrying out Blackwood's final instructions. Beatrice considered his words carefully. Despite everything, she believed he was sincere in his regret. What will you tell Charles now? She asked. Nothing, Bradley replied firmly. As far as I'm concerned, my association with Charles Blackwood ended the moment I understood what kind of man he truly is. With a wry smile, he added, Besides, I suspect Sheriff Morgan would have strong opinions about any further communication between us. The mention of Xavier brought warmth to Beatrice's cheeks. Though they had been discreet, the changed nature of their relationship hadn't gone entirely unnoticed in the small community. I believe he would, she agreed, unable to keep a small smile from her lips. Bradley nodded, acceptance in his expression. You found a good man in Morgan, he said simply. I wish you both happiness. After Bradley's departure, Beatrice contemplated his apology and the remarkable turn her life had taken. In just 2 months, she had traveled from the ruins of her Boston existence to a new life that surpassed her most optimistic hopes. She had meaningful work, a community that valued her contributions, and most unexpectedly a relationship with a man whose quiet strength and integrity daily reinforced her conviction that leaving the East had been the right decision. Xavier had been characteristically restrained in public, maintaining appropriate professional distance during school hours and town functions. But in private moments, evening walks along the creek that gave the town its name, quiet suppers in her small house, Sunday afternoons reading together by her fireplace, he gradually revealed more of himself, the barriers built by grief slowly yielding to the possibility of new happiness. As autumn gave way to winter, their relationship deepened. Xavier spoke more freely of Sarah, sharing memories of their life together with a wistfulness that no longer carried the sharp edge of unresolved grief. In turn, Beatrice confided her own painful history, not just the broken engagement, but her complicated relationship with her father, whose love had always seemed conditional upon her adherence to his ambitions for her. He would have hated Silver Creek, she admitted one evening as they sat before the fire in her small house. Everything about it would have represented failure to him: the modest house, the simple life. Even teaching, which he considered merely a temporary occupation until I made a suitable marriage. Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her palm. And what about you? Do you find it a failure? Beatrice looked around at her small but comfortable home, thought of her students and their progress, considered the man beside her who had shown her what true partnership could be. "I've never been happier," she said simply, "or more certain that I'm exactly where I belong." The conviction in her voice must have reached something deep within Xavier, for his expression softened into rare vulnerability. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice taking on an uncharacteristic hesitancy, "about the future." Beatrice's heart quickened. "Have you?" He nodded, his blue eyes intent on her face. "For a long time after Sarah died, I couldn't imagine a future at all. Each day was just endurance, survival." He paused, his hand tightening around hers. "But lately I've been thinking about tomorrow and the day after. And all the days stretching ahead." "What do you see in those days?" Beatrice asked softly. "You," he replied without hesitation. "Always you." Taking a deep breath, he continued, "I know it's soon, perhaps too soon for proper convention, and I'm not asking for an immediate answer. But I want you to know that when you're ready, I hope you'll consider becoming my wife." Though they had grown increasingly close over the past weeks, the actual proposal caught Beatrice by surprise. Not because she hadn't thought of marriage herself, she had, more frequently than she cared to admit, but because she hadn't expected Xavier to be ready for such a step so soon. Seeing her surprise, Xavier hastened to add, "As I said, there's no rush." "I understand if you need time to—" "Yes," Beatrice interrupted, a smile blooming across her face. "My answer is yes, Xavier." For a moment he seemed unable to process her response. Then joy transformed his features, erasing years of sorrow in an instant. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice hardly above a whisper. "I know I'm not an easy man. The past has marked me in ways that may never fully heal." Beatrice reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that experience had carved around his eyes. "We're both marked by our pasts," she said gently. "But those marks don't define our future unless we allow them to." Xavier turned his head to press a kiss into her palm, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "When should we tell the town?" he asked. "Judge Holloway will want to perform the ceremony himself, I expect." "Let's wait until after Christmas," Beatrice suggested. "Give the children a chance to finish the term without the distraction of their teacher's engagement." Xavier nodded agreement. "Spring wedding, then, when the wildflowers return to the hills." "Perfect," Beatrice replied, leaning forward to seal their agreement with a kiss that promised all the tomorrows they had both once thought beyond their reach. 4 months later, as April painted the hills surrounding Silver Creek with splashes of wildflowers, Beatrice Sawyer became Beatrice Morgan in a ceremony performed by Judge Holloway outside the schoolhouse, where she would continue teaching. The entire town attended, filling the schoolyard with congratulations and well wishes for the couple who had become integral parts of their community. Xavier, resplendent in a new black suit, watched his bride with undisguised adoration as she moved among their guests in her simple ivory gown. The haunted look that had once shadowed his eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment that deepened to joy whenever Beatrice met his gaze across the crowded yard. As the celebration continued into early evening, Judge Holloway found a moment to speak privately with the newly wedded couple. "I have something for you," he said, presenting them with an official-looking document. "Consider it a wedding gift from the territorial governor." Xavier unfolded the paper, his expression changing to surprise as he read its contents. "A land grant?" he asked, looking up at the judge. Holloway nodded, satisfaction evident in his smile. 160 acres along the North Fork of the creek, prime grazing land with good water access and a view of the mountains. "But why?" Beatrice asked, stunned by the generosity of the gift. "The territory needs good people," Holloway replied simply. "People willing to put down roots, build something lasting." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Xavier. "People who understand that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting battles, but in choosing to begin again after loss." Xavier's hand found Beatrice's, their fingers intertwining. "Thank you," he said, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. "This is unexpected." "Life often is," the judge observed with a knowing smile. "Sometimes the best journeys are those that lead us to places we never intended to go." As Judge Holloway moved away to rejoin the other guests, Xavier turned to Beatrice, wonder and determination mingling in his expression. "Our own land," he said softly. "A place to build a home, a future." "A family," Beatrice added, her heart swelling with love for this man who had rescued her in more ways than he would ever know. Xavier's smile held all the promise of that future as he drew her close. "You know," he murmured against her hair, "when I found you lost in the desert that day, I never imagined you'd end up saving me." Beatrice looked up at him, remembering the words that had first connected them. "I said I lost my way," she reminded him. "And I said you'd found me," Xavier completed the memory, his blue eyes bright with emotion. "But the truth is we found each other, and that will always be enough." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the land that would become their home, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found far more than her way. She had found her heart's true destination not in a place, but in the arms of a man who had journeyed through his own wilderness of grief to find new hope in her love. Together, they had transformed loss into possibility, proving that even the most wounded hearts could heal when given the chance to love again. And in the years to come, as they built their home, welcomed children, and watched Silver Creek grow from frontier settlement to thriving community, they would often remember that first exchange in the desert, knowing that in finding each other, they had found everything that truly mattered.